Good morning. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Lori Lincoln, and I am the incoming Chief of Plans, Policy, and Partnerships at the Office of the Staff Advocate at U.S. Cyber Command. This session is titled Advancing Integrated Deterrence in Cyberspace Through National Security Policy. It is my distinct honor to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Stephen Kelly. The President Director for Cybersecurity and Technology, returning to the National Security Council staff after having previously served under the Obama administration. In this role, Mr. Kelly leads national policy making and advises the President and NSC leadership on matters involving cyber defense, critical infrastructure security and resilience, cyber incident management, and relevant emerging technologies. He serves as chair of the U.S. government's Cyber Response Group, Vulnerabilities Equities Process, and the Cyber Interagency Policy Committee. Mr. Kelly is a special agent on detail from the FBI, where he most recently served as the Chief of Cyber Policy. Over his two-decade tenure, Mr. Kelly has served in various cyber program roles in both the FBI field headquarters and at headquarters level. Prior to his government service, Mr. Kelly practiced as a registered professional engineer. At the conclusion of his remarks, he will accept questions from the audience. So as a reminder, if you should ask a question, please unmute your mic. Please welcome Mr. Stephen Kelly.
Thank you, Lori. It's great to be here, and I'm so impressed with how cooperative this group is in bringing everybody back to their seats. I've facilitated conferences before, and it's never been like this. So thank you for that. It's really easy to keep things on time when everybody's so on the ball. So let me set a scene. November 2014, right before the Thanksgiving holiday, at the Eisenhower Executive Office building. So I was a director on the NSC staff responsible for cyber incident response policy and coordination. Sony Pictures Entertainment was nearing release of the most consequential piece of film art, The Interview, starring Seth Rogen and James Franco, when the company was hit by a brutal wiper malware attack, stealing and erasing data and bricking devices. A group calling itself Guardians of Peace claimed credit and began distributing pre-release motion pictures and employee data. To further deter release of the film, the actors published terrorism threats against movie theaters, leading Sony to cancel the film's Christmas Day release. With North Korea as the prime suspect, given the film was a parody of their head of state and had already garnered DPRK's condemnation, the FBI engaged Sony, began investigating, and with support of the NSA and the rest of the IC, the White House was fully engaged. So let's pause a second. Why was this incident nationally significant? Is Sony Pictures critical infrastructure? No. Did the incident expose national security information? No. So why only a few weeks later did FBI Director Comey publicly attribute the attack to the North Korean government, an impressive feat, even by today's standards, followed by statements by President Obama and the imposition of consequences on the responsible actors? While it didn't feel like it at the time, these were the early days of U.S. policy on cyberspace issues. We did not yet have a rubric for deciding when is and is not a nationally significant cyber incident. We did not yet have presidential policy on cyber incident response. And we did not yet have a clear policy and process on how to respond to destabilizing state-sponsored cyber attacks. But some of the building blocks were already in place, and we were about to experience rapid acceleration in our policy plans, our policymaking and planning. One of these building blocks was President Obama's 2011 International Strategy for Cyberspace, which sought a, quote, open, interoperable, secure, and reliable information and communications infrastructure, one that supports international trade and commerce, strengthens international security, and fosters free expression and innovation. To achieve this goal, the strategy committed to building and sustaining an environment in which norms of responsible behavior guide states' actions, sustain partnerships, and support the rule of law in cyberspace. So what are these norms that are referred to in the international strategy? Like, don't threaten the release of an offensive but hilarious film? Not exactly. So let me tell you about a colleague of mine, Michelle Markov, who recently retired from the State Department. Years ago, Michelle began to parlay her years of experience negotiating with the Russians on nuclear issues into a new mission, deterring malicious cyber activity through international norms. Her efforts were key to the 2013 report of the United Nations Group of Governmental Experts in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security. That is a mouthful. And was followed by a subsequent consensus report in 2015. This UN framework consists of 3 pillars. 1, recognition of the applicability of international law, which you heard about a bit from General Counsel Cross. 2, non-binding norms of state behavior in peacetime. 3, cyber confidence building measures. What are these norms? So here's a few. A state should not conduct or knowingly support ICT activity that intentionally damages critical infrastructure or otherwise impairs the use and operation of critical infrastructure to provide services to the public. States should respond to appropriate requests for assistance by another state whose critical infrastructure is subject to malicious ICT acts. The third relevant one is states should also respond to appropriate requests to mitigate malicious ICT activity aimed at the critical infrastructure of another state emanating from their territory. States should take reasonable steps to ensure that the integrity of the supply chain and seek to prevent the proliferation of malicious ICT tools and techniques and the use of harmful hidden functions. And lastly, I'd like to highlight states should encourage responsible reporting of ICT vulnerabilities and share associated information on available remedies. My favorite norm against conducting cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property with the intent of providing competitive advantages to companies and commercial sectors is not on the GGE list, but was agreed to during President Xi's state visit to Washington in 2015, and it is included in the G7 declaration from 2017. There clearly remains work to be done in enforcing that one. So soon thereafter, President Trump signed Executive Order 13800, which tasked a range of studies and reports on cyber issues, including deterrence. And later, an interagency policy committee was tasked with writing that administration's national cyber strategy. I was back in the FBI at that point in a new policy role and had a front row seat to these efforts. What you'll find comforting is, generally, the steady arc of U.S. policy. Did the State Department's EO 13800 report to the President on cyber deterrence take a crazy Ivan? No. Did President Trump's national cyber strategy blaze an adventurous path? No, it did not. Both built on the work of the Obama administrations to advance the cause of the GGE reports on cyber norms and led to the development of a cyber deterrence playbook to operationalize everything that came before it, a playbook that is in use to this day. The playbook is premised on the need for timely responses to counter-normative actions by offending states. So it serves as a resource to aid the decision-making process. Of note, the flowchart process laid out in the playbook allows us to begin moving the wheels even before we have solid attribution. But we will, of course, need it in the end. It all starts with a cyber incident and a question. If this were an intentional act by a state, would this warrant a response? So a key element to deterrence is to confront unacceptable behavior. Now, we all know this from parenting. If you let it slide, behavior gets worse. Failing to confront unacceptable behavior in cyberspace is escalatory. Whether you know it or not, you are defining what is not a red line. As is the case in our interagency policymaking process, silence is concurrence. If you don't like something, you better speak up and act. However, one country speaking up is often not enough. But a chorus of 20, 30, or 40 countries cannot be ignored. And even if the consequence action of a single country, like economic sanctions or a diplomatic action, doesn't move the needle, complementary actions by 20, 30, or 40 countries really adds up and can serve to isolate the offending state. That is a theory of another element of Michel's vision, reflected in the last administration's national cyber strategy, to socialize elements of our cyber deterrence playbook with like-minded countries and build a coalition to call out counter-normative state-sponsored cyber activity. And it's been working. Two quick examples include responses to Russian GRU's outrageous actions against the World Anti-Doping Agency and Chinese MSS for the widespread and irresponsible compromise of Microsoft Exchange Server. I'll talk a bit more, I'll provide another example in a few minutes. So please indulge me again while I insert myself back into the story. So fast forward just a little bit, and Deputy National Security Advisor Ann Neuberger called me unexpectedly and asked if I would come back to the NSC staff for another tour. So my first day back was Monday, July 18th, 2022. Does anybody remember what was happening on that day? That very morning, I was informed that Albania's government networks had been hit by a wiper malware attack, and the prime suspect was Iran. But this time, we were armed with a policy and a process to confront the challenge. I immediately initiated the cyber deterrence playbook, scheduled a snap meeting of the cyber response group, which convened the U.S. Embassy and all the relevant departments and agencies, and the wheels started moving. FBI deployed a team to Tirana, which linked up with Jones International and Microsoft, who were providing support to the Albanians. The weight of the U.S. intelligence community was engaged, and we were able to quickly attribute the attack to the Iranian MOAS. A mere 51 days later, Prime Minister Rama announced Iranian culpability, closed the Iranian embassy, and severed diplomatic ties. 31 nations, plus the EU and NATO, joined us in making statements of support for Albania, statements of condemnation for Iran, and many of which imposed their own consequences. This is what international teamwork looks like. So let's jump ahead to the Biden administration's recently released national cybersecurity strategy. Where does it fit into the storyline? A top priority of this administration has been countering ransomware. The strategy states, for the first time, that ransomware has risen to the level of a national security threat and is not a problem that can be solved through the criminal justice system alone. And by making this statement, we are taking our gloves off and considering any and all instruments of national power in confronting it. Russia is at the center of the ransomware pandemic. As a haven for the world's most significant cybercrime actors, they are most certainly challenging one or more of the key UN norms. These ransomware attacks have affected a range of victims across the globe, including hospitals, schools, and public safety services. Confronting the ransomware challenge requires international teamwork, which is why the White House launched the International Counter-Ransomware Initiative, and in October, we welcomed around 35 countries to Washington to collaborate on 4 goals, and they are improving resilience, disrupting the threat actors, countering illicit finance, cultivating public-private cooperation, and leveraging diplomacy. And our coalition continues to grow and is beginning to bear fruit with some notable multinational disruption operations. I'll note the recently released National Cybersecurity Strategy is a cybersecurity strategy, focused more on defense and resilience than its predecessor. Improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity is a key pillar of this strategy, as was discussed with Brandon Wills just a few moments ago. This is urgently needed given our dependence on automation and our adversaries' intent to hold it at risk. And this includes defense critical infrastructure. Deterrence by denial must be an essential element of our approach if we are to succeed in conflict. First, it's hard to miss the fact that the very first strategic objective for critical infrastructure calls for critical infrastructure cybersecurity regulations, the dreaded R word. This used to be the political third rail, but given recent disruptions to U.S. critical infrastructure, it is time to set some minimum expectations, such as laid out in CISA's cross-sector cyber performance goals. And we're not talking about a high bar here, Just the basics, like multi-factor authentication, patch management, data encryption, and removing access for departed employees. Frankly, there's nothing new under the sun, as CISA's cyber performance goals quite resemble the CIS top 20 list. We've known what to do for a decade or two, but we can't seem to get it right in the most critical facilities and systems. We're already along the path to raising the bar in a sector-by-sector approach, using what authorities we have and then work with Congress to close gaps. For example, TSA's security directives for pipelines, rail, and aviation, and more recently, EPA released an interpretive rule adding cybersecurity requirements for drinking water facilities. Given industry's muted and in some cases positive response to this part of the strategy, it seems like the idea of regulating the safety and security of critical infrastructure is no longer controversial. The strategy also calls for encouraging safety and security by design through an Internet of Things security labeling program. The White House in October held a summit with leaders from academia and industry on this topic and announced our intention to roll out a labeling program in the spring, essentially Energy Star for cyber. Imagine a future when you can go on Amazon to buy an IoT product for your home and be able to quickly sort cheap and risky Chinese products from safe and secure products that will be supported over their service life. Researchers from Carnegie Mellon who presented at our meeting in October have demonstrated that customers are willing to pay a premium, 20% for sure, but maybe as high as 40% for security and privacy. We're also getting a lot of questions about the strategy's call to drive better cybersecurity practices in the cloud computing industry. For most small and medium-sized businesses, they're better off subscribing to cloud offerings instead of ruling their own security. And we also view cloud service providers as a great point of leverage for increasing the overall security posture of the nation. Even in the absence of a regulatory regime, approaches such as FedRAMP can help drive the market, benefiting non-government purchasers. But we think customers should not have to pay extra for security in these products. They should be safe and secure by design, like cars with seatbelts and non-exploding fuel tanks, for those that are old enough to remember the Pinto from the 70s. Baseline security features should be standard in cloud offerings. And because companies big and small rely on cloud services, including critical infrastructure owners and operators, cybersecurity requirements for cloud providers will drive the market towards better security and resilience broadly. A key pillar to cybersecurity is the need to trust your software. In 2021, President Biden signed Executive Order 14028 on improving the nation's cybersecurity, which set an ambitious goal for improving the protection of federal government systems, but in the process has set in motion activities that are being adopted across the global community. Among other actions, the order called for efforts to improve the security and integrity of the software supply chain and emphasized the importance of secure software development environments. These practices and requirements would be introduced into federal procurement so that when we have increased assurance the software being used by our departments and agencies is secure. As a starting point, the order directed NIST to issue guidance identifying practices that enhance the security of the software supply chain. And as was done over 8 years ago in developing the cybersecurity framework, NIST undertook an open and collaborative process to develop this guidance. This led to publication of NIST Special Publication 800-218, called the Secure Software Development Framework, and the NIST Software Supply Chain Security Guidance. Taken together, these two documents provide a set of practices that create the foundation for developing secure software. The National Cybersecurity Strategy doubles down on more secure software, calling for a statutory change in how liability in this space works. Unless you are the largest of purchasers, you typically waive your ability to hold the software maker liable through a hold harmless clause in the end user licensing agreement that nobody reads. Imagine if that were the standard practice with buying a car. In return for adhering to a standard of due care, which would include secure software development practices, a software bill of materials, and use of memory-safe languages, the strategy calls for liability safe harbor. That seems like a balanced approach to me. Regulatory mandates are not the only point of leverage in achieving safety and security. The insurance industry led the change on boiler safety in the late 1800s. And in my view, the cyber insurance industry represents a significant point of leverage for change in the cybersecurity industry. While regulatory standards for cyber due care are often lacking, insurance underwriting standards can serve the same purpose. Furthermore, the bundling of insurance and security products by the insurtechs seem to be paying off with markedly lower incidence of their insureds. I'm interested to see how the cyber insurance industry develops, as it remains a small fraction of legacy coverages like property and casualty, with the big money on the sidelines. To add stability and confidence to the insurance market, the strategy calls for creating an insurance backstop against catastrophic losses incurred as a result of a systemic cyber incident. This might resemble the terrorism risk insurance program created by Congress after 9/11. I'm interested to see how the cyber insurance market matures and influences the cybersecurity and safety space. That pretty much brings us to the current date. As the cyber threat landscape has evolved, the lines between state and non-state actors has blurred. Along with it, division of labor among civilian network defenders, law enforcement, intelligence, and military cyber units is less clear. My parting message to interagency lawyers is this: mission success today requires agility and teamwork. Help your clients to be creative in how they engage the threat and deliver effects through multi-mission authorities and capabilities. As we've seen, no two operations will ever be exactly the same. So thank you for what you do to enable the mission and keep up the good fight.
We will now open it for questions from the audience.
Microphone?
Sorry, hopefully this is loud enough. Andrea Basaraba, DOGC. Thanks so much for those remarks. I was curious how you guys, or you particularly, are thinking through the potential threats or maybe benefits of models like ChatGPT as we see, their proliferation and maybe different applications and even just their creation.
So this is a topic of great debate right now in the NSC staff and also within the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. I don't want to get ahead of Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. We've just delivered to him a memo with a range of proposed activities and options. And so just know everyone is very focused on this right now, and it seems like we've hit a moment. This topic hasn't been new, but I think in terms of awareness in the public, the open letter that Musk and others initiated, that certainly was catalyzing also ChatGPT being available for more broad use and people being able to touch it and play with it, has created some some feedback that's generated a lot of public interest. So there's opportunities, but there's also significant risks, and more to come on that. Quiet group.
Mr. Kelly, I'll ask you a question.
Okay.
You've mentioned the cyber deterrence playbook. What we in DoD, especially the military, really like to conduct AARs. So what are some of the lessons learned that you take back for some of the incidents that you talked about today when you employed the cyber deterrence playbook?
Well, first of all, we haven't used it that many times, and I'll just reflect on my own personal viewpoints. I think it is also something that's built in that when we execute the book, we're supposed to be then doing an after action to see kind of how did that work. I know on the Albania topic, I can't remember if we did that or not, but my main kind of reflection on having used the process is what an advantage it is to have all of that already put together. Because it wasn't just creating a flow chart. We also did some foundational work in authoring it, where we wrote papers, and this book is essentially a compendium of our thinking of why public attribution matters and what are the modes of that and what are the policy aims of doing so. And building the international coalition. And so there's this body of knowledge that's contained in there that we can then use that, or pieces of it. There are pieces of it that are highly classified. There's other pieces of it that are less so. The fact of the book is unclassified, but the inner workings perhaps are more sensitive. But having well, just like in any mission area, if there's not a procedure and you're now in a kind of an up-tempo situation, things don't go as well as they would be, with a good plan. And so it was quite remarkable how smoothly the process kicked off with the Albania response, and a number of people that were familiar with the process were able to kind of help us just to move through the process, and it was smooth and easy. So I think that's the main thing. Good planning makes for good execution. And I was blessed to be able to have that. Oh, actually, no. I do have one more reflection on that. A key takeaway was the ability to get at least some critical mass on the ground to work with the Albanians. I know oftentimes with incident response nowadays, even some of these incident response firms, they are doing remote response, using their tools and such, and they might be on a corporate network and they're not physically there. The ability to have a country team that is engaged, the deputy chief of mission, if you have a legal attaché there, the defense attaché, all the right people that can engage with the host government and to have the lines of communication is essential. For this particular incident, having FBI being able to send a cyber assistant legal attaché from a nearby country, and then that got augmented. That was a difference maker in making sure that we knew what was happening, the information was coming back, the coordination both with the host country and with the two private sector entities that I mentioned. That is a key aspect. And in some cases, we don't need to fly a large team in, but we need to have a critical mass of a couple few cyber capable people who can serve as interlocutors. And so that was a difference maker. And that was repeated a number of times since. With helping out the Costa Ricans, helping out the Montenegrins, may have been one or two others as well, where having some on the ground cyber folks is a difference maker.
Hi, sir. Captain Thaddeus Larkin, U.S. Cybercom OSJA. You talked a lot about how market forces are helping drive incentives for better cybersecurity practices in the private sector, and staying sort of away from that third rail of regulations necessarily. I wonder if there's any appetite or discussion besides using just the stick of incentives, but also a carrot for the private sector, specifically with regards to, say, something like liability protections, if they're able to cooperate with the government. We heard from other speakers about, building trust with the federal government for reporting breaches, things like that. Is that something that you're thinking about, considering, or that there's an appetite for?
You bet. And I just were kind of reflecting back on my time in the Obama administration. We were talking a lot at that time about critical infrastructure, cybersecurity. We're still talking about that. But Obama had just signed Executive Order 13636 on that topic, and Presidential Policy Directive 21 had just been released. Those were companions on critical infrastructure, security, and resilience. And at that time, we had very few levers for regulating cybersecurity into critical infrastructure, other than the few sectors that you can think of, electric grid and such. And so there was a lot of conversations about how do you incentivize the uptake of cybersecurity best practices. Is there a way that we can have money available to help fund it, these sorts of things. A lot of conversations led to, one of the points that I made in my remarks, which is that the cyber insurance industry will solve this because there's a complete alignment between underwriting standards and premiums. kind of advancing to today, clearly we're taking a little bit more of a regulatory bent in our thinking, where we're less reticent to go down that path, and it seems like the community is ready for that. But there's still a lot of opportunity to do kind of things on more of the carrot side. There are a number of areas where liability protections are either in place or being talked about. So one is in the CIRCIA, Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, that was passed fairly recently, which mandates cyber incident reporting for critical infrastructure owners and operators. And the information that is mandatorily reported actually is afforded liability protection, and also privilege is maintained in doing so. And that's a big problem where most companies, when they have an incident, they're hiring outside counsel. They're running all the incident response services through that, and sometimes the government folks get the hand and say, we can't talk to you. So maintaining attorney-client privilege is enormously important. And so that particular regime does provide some protections. The Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015 also has some liability protections as well. I think that kind of the desire by the private sector for liability protections, of course, if you don't ask for it, you're not going to get it, but I personally think it's a bit of a red herring. Because in most cases, what's the scenario under which the act of sharing is going to cause you to be sued by a third party and you're exposed to civil damages liability? I can think of a couple scenarios, but it's pretty far-fetched. But at this point, enough conversations have happened around liability protection that everybody wants it. So in the context of the IoT security labeling program, we've been talking to a lot of industry groups about that. What I didn't say in my remarks is that we're going to be rolling that program out and making a pretty major announcement in May. And the trade groups are asking for liability protection. So if they sign up for a labeling program and conformity assessment program by which their widget gets stamped with the U.S. Good Housekeeping seal, that in some way they are protected from suits from their customers. I don't know what the left to right limits of that should be, or if that's even necessary. Frankly, I think that adhering to a conformity assessment regime, but for the case that you're making material representations or misusing the mark, it's a great affirmative defense, frankly, that your product is safe and secure and you've measured up to a standard. What other liability protections might be afforded? I don't know, but the idea around cloud service providers and making sure that there's security built in there, and maybe there's some liability protections that can be included in such a concept, we're certainly open to that conversation, and members of Congress are very engaged as well. I just don't fully know what that would look like. One other area of carrot is we have, as Brandon mentioned, $1 trillion of infrastructure spending that we're making through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and not just that one, a couple of other programs. And it is our intent, actually we're already starting down this path, to make sure that wherever we can, we're inserting cybersecurity requirements into those grant offers and those investments. And so that's another way that we can help to fund the efforts by especially municipal utilities that can't afford it. We want to go ahead and make it possible through this pretty historic investment, frankly. So those are a few thoughts on the topic. Over here.
You talked about kind of confronting bad acts in cyber for purposes of deterrence or for managing escalation, and talked about the framework of norms from the UNGGE process. I'm wondering, since we're a room full of lawyers, but from your policy perspective, what you see as the relative kind of benefits and drawbacks of confronting adversaries or bad acts in cyberspace through the norms framework versus through legal, like laws and other legal frameworks, and how do you think about that from a policy perspective?
Well, it's certainly our, and by the way, I only have a policy perspective because I'm a non-lawyer. So I think that to the extent that we have a non-state actor, we should be, well, actually, frankly, we're using the criminal justice system in all contexts. You've seen the Department of Justice announce indictments against a range of actors, including intelligence officers and military cyber unit personnel. And so I think that we see, if there's a good, solid connection, both we need a crime in the United States, which is not hard, so the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, by and large, connected to a clearly counter-normative activity, that we want to call that out. We want to use all the levers that we can. And so you've seen criminal justice means used in those contexts, even though we don't anticipate that we'd ever get our hands on these actors. They're just not going to travel. But does that have a deterrent effect? I think it will take a lot of time to tell, because it does constrain the lifestyle of the individual who has been charged with a crime. They may not be able to go to the south of France and enjoy their vacation. For non-state actors who may be acting in alignment with a nation's policy, like we've seen a lot of patriotically motivated hackers jumping in on the Russia-Ukraine scenario. We're going to go after them to the extent that we have a crime for which the U.S. has venue. We're going to go after them and seek to apprehend them and bring them to justice in the U.S. I don't know if I see that much of a distinction between going after it on the basis of norms versus law. I think the norms hook is going to motivate us, and maybe is even the litmus test that and I can't speak for the Justice Department in terms of their prosecutorial manual, but I would suspect that if we had a foreign intelligence service cyber operator taking action against the United States in a way that is in line with asking what information would we need to be able to put an incident into a broader policy construct that perhaps we don't have, and we would need the on-the-ground team to get those answers to come back?
Yeah, I think that actually in part may answer part of the question, because the question is about what information gaps you're recognizing in order to operate at the national level. And so if it's in order to develop further policy, maybe that's part of the answer, is that you need the information in order to see what policy gaps exist to develop, or are there other information gaps that you see at the national level?
Well, let me start in one place, and maybe we'll get to where you are. I made reference in my remarks to the fact that when the Sony Pictures incident happened, we didn't have a rubric for determining, whether that was bad, and that we should be focusing on it at a policy level or not. I'm not sure what words I used, but in the year after, it was 2015 that we published our first cyber incident severity schema, and so hopefully your people that are sitting in watch floors are aware of this and have it, and it's a color-coded system from white, green, or yellow, orange, red, black, with all the levels of pain and anguish. And it has, and the whole purpose of that was to try to define some factors that we need to be looking for, the information requirements in X happened, does it matter? And one of the motivators behind that was I was sitting in the position just doing the grunt work at the NSC. Lisa Monaco was the assistant to the president for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, so she was our boss. I was working for Michael Dano at the time. And we were constantly getting questions about something that was running on CNN. And there was a lot of examples. I think there was a kind of a terrorism-aligned group that was hacking systems that contain military service member information, related to the GWAT. And so I think it was vendors that maybe catered to that group and other sources of information. And then they would dox those service members and their families and invite terrorists to go after them. And so that was an example of the type of scenario that's on the news, and Ms. Monaco was asking questions as to what's happening, is that, what's the deal with that? And we needed kind of a way of articulating, and put that into context. We had other things where it's just a DDoS attack against this or that, or a web defacement. And if it was on the news, we were hearing about it and answering questions. So we needed some way to de-escalate and escalate, frankly. And so we came up with that. its intention is to answer the questions you just mentioned, which is what are the information requirements necessary to decide whether something is nationally significant and thus is worthy of, your 3-star hearing about it, or the National Security Advisor hearing about it, or briefing it up to the President, or should we be having, should we be talking about it in the Cyber Response Group? And I'm not sure. I think opinions vary as to how well it's working. Part of it is you never know the complete facts. And so something's happening, let's talk about it, and I've got about 30% of the story. And it takes a little bit of a while for the rest to flesh out. But I think it's asking the right questions. And we have to look at something from the context of kind of impact on, public safety and civil liberties, impact on foreign policy, impact on national security, and so I think all the right questions are there. It's just a matter of chasing it down and figuring out what the answer to those questions are. I'm not sure if I've gotten a lot of new insights in the last 8 months that I've been in this current role that would cause me to think that approach was wrong. It's more about the fog of war in the early hours. I'll give another example. I'm trying to remember if this is open sources. I think it is. You have a software vulnerability that's announced, and you're wondering whether whatever that issue is constitutes kind of the next software supply chain scenario. So is it a big deal? Is it a small deal? And you need technical people to think through the chain of events that might happen as a result of that. Where if, for instance, the signing certificates for a patch management system, are corrupted, and would that provide the nexus to get to a large constituency? These are questions that need to be answered in order to decide whether it's something that we're pulling the alarm on, or if it's just the everyday thing. And so I think it does come down to trying to understand what would make something significant nationally, and then who can get you those answers on a timely basis. And then what are the mechanisms to make sure that we're doing that efficiently, so we don't have 9 different agencies reaching out trying to get the same question answered from the victim. We have that problem as well.
Good morning, sir. Dane Bloxman, Joint Task Force Areas. From your position on the NSC, can you provide any insight on President Biden's recent executive order on commercial spyware?
Yes. So this is a challenging space, and actually there's some norms hooks for some of these tools. We never want to box ourselves in national policy and say we're never going to use something or purchase something or take advantage of something. If there's an intelligence requirement or a military need or a law enforcement need, maybe it makes perfect sense. But the space for commercial tools of that sort is a complicated one, as is the broader exploit marketplace, where bad actors are out there finding stuff, selling it to the highest bidder, and there are significant vulnerabilities in the ecosystem. And so we want to be as careful and responsible as we can be in how we're developing our knowledge of vulnerabilities. Where are we getting our tools? Obviously, we're building a lot of tools ourselves. Sometimes we're procuring a tool. And we need to be very careful about how that works. And we want to be encouraging other countries to kind of to police the ecosystem, to make sure that folks are acting responsibly. I'm the chair of the Vulnerabilities Equities process, so I've got a better viewpoint into this is not about the commercial tools side necessarily, but there is certainly a connection that we need to make sure that we have a responsible process where we are restricting vulnerabilities that we're going to be using for operational purposes with keen attention and considering what the broader risks are and balancing those risks, and then only keeping the things that we need and releasing for responsible disclosure and patching the things that we don't need. And so we're constantly reevaluating that process to make sure that we've got the right balance. On the commercial space, spyware space, that was a big announcement that Jake Sullivan made a number of months ago, and this executive order kind of delivers on the promise that we're going to take a very careful approach at that.
Okay. Thank you, Steve, very much for your insightful perspective and open discussion. On behalf of Colonel Hayden and the entire Office of the Staff Judge Advocate, we'd like to thank you with a coin, a token of our appreciation. This concludes our morning session. For our virtual audience, we will begin promptly our afternoon session at 13:30. For a few administrative remarks for our in-person attendees, you will have lunch for an hour and a half. If anyone is interested, we will have a bus to shuttle you to the food court. It should be out there now and will return at 13:10. Additionally, if you are interested in partaking in the coffee and food, please submit your $15 landing fee. Thank you very much, and see you back before 13:30.
Greetings from U.S. Fleet Cyber Command. My name is Lieutenant Commander David Lane, and I'm here to provide a brief overview of our command and what we do. Fleet Cyber Command has responsibilities touching almost all aspects of the information domain. We break these responsibilities into 4 overarching hats that our commander wears. First, as U.S. Fleet Cyber Command, we're the Navy's service component to U.S. Cybercom and service cryptologic component to NSA CSS. Wearing this hat, we plan, coordinate, integrate, synchronize, direct, and conduct full-spectrum cyberspace operational activities required to ensure freedom of action across all of the Navy's warfighting domains in and through cyberspace. We also serve as the Navy's authorizing official responsible for the oversight of the DoD risk management framework, ensuring that the Navy's information systems have implemented assigned cybersecurity controls, identified risks, and implemented safeguards from design through fielding. Our U.S. 10th Fleet hat is our operational element and executes our mission through a task force structure similar to that used by other fleet commanders. This includes ensuring command and control capabilities, as well as deliverance of defensive cyber and space operations. In our 10th Fleet hat, we also operationalize our cryptologic and SIGINT missions. As NavSpace, we're the Navy Service Component Commander to U.S. Space Command and offer centralized coordination of Navy space activities and promote better integration of space and maritime tasks, ensuring maritime superiority from the seafloor to space. Finally, as Joint Force Headquarters Cyber Navy, we are a subordinate headquarters to U.S. Cybercom, tasked with providing support to U.S. Indo-PACOM, U.S. Forces Korea, and U.S. Southcom. Through this hat, we exercise operational control over joint cyber mission forces and provide planning and integration support through our cyberspace operations integrated planning elements. Our domain, particularly in our 10th Fleet hat, is widespread and includes the Navy's Information Operations Commands, or NIOCs, and various task groups assigned specific functional or geographic missions. We also provide cyberspace operations integrated planning elements embedded at the geographic combatant commands we support. These elements fully integrate cyberspace operations into operational plans, ensuring timing and tempo are set by the commanders for use of cyber effects in the field. Our focus day in and day out comes down to 3 operational objectives: ensure C2, provide maritime and space domain awareness, and deliver cyber and space effects. We do this through 5 command priorities: warfighting, readiness, innovation, integration, and partners and allies. These priorities enable us to execute our mission and provide cyber and space capabilities around the globe in support of combatant command and national priorities.